Hi, everybody. Namaste, Adab, Johar, and thank you so much for being here at hashtag Love, Sex, and Data. We are on day 2 of this digital conference, and we've been having some amazing conversations around the transformational power of pleasure. We hope you've been able to catch some of our sessions, and we really do hope that you will be with us for all the sessions that have been planned ahead. I'm Deepshikha. My name is Deepshikha, and I am from the YP Foundation, and I am your MC for this session. And while I know that, like me, you're all excited to hear from our keynote speaker, I will quickly just run through a few announcements so that everybody can equally enjoy this entire experience. So first things first, as you can all see on the bottom left of your screen, we have our wonderful Indian Sign Language interpreter who is here to translate the entire session. In addition to that, we also have translations available for this session in Hindi and in Marathi. If you would like to access the conversations in either of those languages, you can go and click on the globe icon on the bottom of your screen and choose your preferred language. Please do not forget to mute the original audio, and all these instructions will be available to you on chat as well. So as we partake in this discussion, let us remember that the conference is a space to rejuvenate, reflect, and learn together. Please engage with an open heart, with a lot of compassion and respect, even in disagreement. The discussions here will engage with ideas and issues of gender, sexuality, desire, as well as prevention of discrimination and violence in an affirming manner. In case you have any concerns around safety or have any complaints, you can reach us on the email addresses shared in the chat box. We care for your safety. In the chat box itself, you will find links for the conference's participation guidelines and the safeguarding policy. And the website is the best place to find all of these information and more collated together. So please do check it out. We also have a question and answer session post the keynote address. So please feel free to send in your questions via the Q&A box. Again, you will find that icon at the bottom of your screen. And you can watch the session live on the LST YouTube channel, Agents of Ishq's Facebook and Twitter handles, and the YP Foundation's Facebook and Twitter handle. So you can go and check this session out there. And if you have any questions, you can leave them in comments there as well. So now that we're done with the announcement, let's move towards the topic of the discussion. Our complex relationship with data is Sadyo Purani. It's absolutely ancient. So in this keynote address titled Criminal Histories, Caste, Gender, and the criminal injustice system, we delve a little deeper into this relationship and how some bodies are easily marked as the other, as the deviant, therefore justifying the violence perpetrated on them. In our work, we find that young people too are brought together in this easy category of youth without enough acknowledgement of social hierarchies and context that they navigate. So this talk and the speaker's work highlights caste and gender as important locations from which we must understand the issues of gender, sexuality, and pleasure. Finally, super excited to introduce the amazing Nikita Sonavane. We are very, very lucky to have her. Nikita is a lawyer and the co-founder of the Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project, which is a Bhopal-based litigation and research intervention. It focuses on building accountability against the criminalization of marginalized communities by the police and by the criminal justice system. And as someone who kind of finds the language of law really scary and mind-boggling, I am really grateful to her for attempting to make the legal jargon more accessible and engaging. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you here and the opportunity to listen to you, Nikita. Welcome to the conference. In the session, we also have Manak, and many of you have already got the opportunity to meet with Manak virtually in the previous sessions. Manak is a feminist queer activist and the executive director of the YP Foundation, who are also the co-organizers of this conference. Manak has worked on issues of gender justice, sexuality rights as a campaigner, youth organizer, documentary filmmaker, and leads direct on-ground intervention as well. He works to support young people's reflective social change leadership. So without further ado, I am going to hand over the session to Nikita, waiting to eagerly hear from you, Nikita. The stage is all yours.
Thank you, Deepshika, for that lovely introduction, and thank you for having me here. Thank you mainly to the agents of Ishq and the YP Foundation for inviting me to have this conversation around criminalization, and particularly the criminalization of Vimukta women. I want to start by talking about how the year 2021 marks 150 years since the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871 came into being. This was a law that branded several communities, primarily nomadic and semi-nomadic communities, as criminals by birth. And it is the narratives of these communities and their resistance against an oppressive criminal justice system that I want to reflect on today. And I want to do that by providing, to begin with, by providing some context about the criminalized tribes, the erstwhile criminalized tribes, who are also known as the denotified tribes, and who assert themselves as the Vimukta communities. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, that these were several hundred communities that were branded as hereditary criminals, ones that were addicted to commission of bailable and non-bailable offences, those that were criminals by birth by the Criminal Tribes Act that was enacted by the British government in 1871. And it's a law that in so many ways was a combination of course, racist European criminal anthropology and the Indian caste system, which assigned this criminality by birth to several communities. And what it did was that as a result of this branding of these communities, said that it was important to control them and to maintain that kind of social control. And therefore, in almost a coterminous manner in the 1840s is when we see the sort of inception and the birth of the Indian police force, which was put in place to control this population and to say that we want to maintain social order in line with this. And these were communities that I mentioned were mainly forest dwelling communities, nomadic, that had their traditional occupations, that traditionally brewed alcohol, were traditional entertainers and performers. And it is that the CTA tried to control and put these communities in settlements, and what did that mean for the lives of these communities, right? And what did that mean for their relationship with the police that was in so many ways put together in order to control these communities. So it meant that these communities had to register themselves and report themselves to the police. They were required to notify to the police any change in any kind of registration. It meant that their physical data, so their biometric data, whether it was their fingerprints, their handprints, all of this data came to be recorded by the police. It also meant that there were these sort of physical descriptions that were put in place to say that people who looked a certain way, had certain kinds of physical features, were ones that were committing these crimes and were ones that belonged to the criminal tribes. And it is that kind of history that perpetuates the kind of stigma and is kind of the origin story of the violence that the criminal justice system began perpetuating against the Vimukta communities. And it is very important to say that while the CTA was a colonial construct, it is one that derived its rationality from the caste system. There are several Vimukta communities that fall outside of the caste system, and therefore it was in line with the caste system and in line with that sort of casteist social control narrative that the Criminal Tribes Act and subsequently that the institution of policing were put in place. And in 1952, which is half a decade after the Indian independence, is when the Indian independent state decided to repeal the Criminal Tribes Act. But what did it mean for these communities, right? It meant that almost immediately, along with the Criminal Tribes Act, it was subsequently replaced with a large number of provisions that were known as the habitual offenders provisions. These were provisions that were put in place to say, okay, there are certain communities that routinely commit these crimes. So, in common parlance, we see them being called rowdies or history sheeters. And we see them being used in pop culture, particularly these kind of crime shows that in recent times have acquired that kind of following. And so it is these communities that were now branded as habitual offenders. And what does that mean now, in the post-independent, in so many ways, the post-colonial Indian state? It means that the surveillance of these communities still continues. The registers that were maintained by the police station in the CTA era is one that still continues to be maintained, and people are required to routinely report to police stations and keep renewing their details of their family members, details of their friends, etc. Are all of these really lengthy and vast details are recorded by local police stations. And to speak from my experience of working with Vimukta communities here in Madhya Pradesh, I can tell you that the surveillance over these communities extends to the degree that, even at this point, there are several Vimukta communities that are required to report to the local police station well in advance, even if there is a wedding or any kind of ceremony or event that is taking place in a family. So this is how through the CTE and a legacy that has been upheld by the Indian criminal justice system through a vast range of nebulous provisions that are termed as the habitual offenders provisions, that criminality continues to be inscribed to the bodies of Vimukta communities. And it is against this background that, I want to locate today's talk and particularly reflect on the situation of Vimukta women, right? And before we do that, I just want to provide a brief and perhaps an oversimplistic view of the idea of Brahminical patriarchy, because that is central to the understanding of the question of gender and particularly the question of women in the Indian context, right? Because it is a structure that is unique to Hinduism and stems from the Hindu religion, and one that focuses on the relationship between caste and gender and defines a set of rules and institution where, women and women's bodies becomes crucial to maintaining the boundaries between castes. So we see that it's a structure that seeks to control the sexuality, particularly of upper caste women, because it is considered to be necessary to maintain caste purity. So we see this sort of binary that is emerging through the institution of Brahminical patriarchy. We see that on the one hand, the dominant caste or the oppressor caste woman is considered to be honorable and whose sexuality is one that needs to be controlled in order to maintain caste purity. But on the other hand, you see this characterization of women who belong to the oppressed caste groups as sexually accessible, right? And I want to reflect on how these ideas of Brahminical patriarchy have steeped into the criminal justice system. And I want to do this and reflect on this through the lens of policing. And why does the lens of policing become important? It's because it is the institution of policing that is in so many ways the entry point into the criminal justice system. The institution of policing is one that creates this conceptualization of who are criminals or which are the bodies that need to be viewed from this lens of criminality and therefore need to be dealt with by the criminal justice system, right? So particularly, we see that there is this archetype of the criminal Indian woman is one that I want to reflect on through the institution of policing. So, we've seen, of course, that there is this conception of women, particularly non-dominant caste women, and that sort of binary that has been created through Brahminical patriarchy. But we also see that this idea of the criminal Indian woman and how has that emerged, particularly through the colonial state, right? So we see that, the uncivilized Indian woman is one who's considered to be immoral and deceitful, and those kind of figures that require to be disciplined, right? And that is how the colonial state views these bodies. So it's in so many ways derived from these Victorian stereotypes of the civilized woman and the uncivilized woman who needs to be civilized, right? So we also see, therefore, that the category of women in the colonial imagination, especially ones that are considered to be loose and deviant, are influenced by the institution of caste. Whereas I mentioned before, there are certain women who are considered to be, immoral and considered to be deceitful. So we see that it is the vilification of nomadic communities and Vimukta communities as being criminal, and particularly Vimukta women, that is located within this sort of idea of criminalization and the criminal woman that the Victorian colonial government puts together, right? And so particularly we see the case of the Infanticide Act of 1870, which creates this idea of the criminal Indian woman by saying that the entire culpability of infanticide rests solely on the woman, neglecting the social context and the role of the state and, of course, the male partners and the caste system, right? And it says, the key strategy of criminalizing infanticide is therefore in so many ways becomes this recasting of the Indian female sexuality as being depraved, as those who have perverted maternal instincts and therefore no moral codes. So, the colonial Indian state propagates this idea of the criminal woman as being easily available as those who have fallen from grace. And I want to delve into how this narrative of the loose Indian, easily available woman is a trope that is relied on repeatedly to not just criminalize women belonging to Bahujan communities and particularly Vimukta communities, but also one that is used to invisibilize the harm that is caused to them. So it is against this background of the casteist criminality that I want to focus on the everyday criminality that is encoded in the bodies of Vimukta women by the Indian criminal justice system, and one that is perpetuated by the institution of policing. Can we move to the slide that talks about why police data is important? Hi, is there a slide here? Okay, I'll just continue. So I want to talk about, why it is important to look at police data and why it is important to see what it is that is happening in the institution of policing, right? And in this regard, we looked at FIRs that were filed in the state of Madhya Pradesh across 3 districts under the Excise Act. The Excise Act is, of course, one that was put into being, way back, of course, by the British government, and one that was used to control the sale of alcohol by the state and used to therefore criminalize those communities and the livelihoods of those communities. Sorry, I can't see the PPT. Yeah, and used to criminalize the livelihoods of those communities. Okay, I will need a second. I am on speaker view. I'm just going to continue. Is used to criminalize the lives of those communities that are considered to be, who were traditionally selling alcohol. So this is, and it's important also to look at FIRs because, it is an FIR, a first information report, that sets criminal law into motion and tells us what kind of narratives are being relied on to, usher an individual into the criminal justice system, right? Therefore, in order to understand the reach of the criminal justice system is why we looked at these FIRs. So if we look at the Excise Act, we looked at about 540 FIRs that were registered under the Excise Act of 1915 in Madhya Pradesh across 3 districts. We looked at the time period of between the years 2018 to 2020. And what we also did is that we looked at the arrest data from these 6 districts where these FIRs were registered. So to talk a little bit about what does the Excise Act do and what is in so many ways the legal framework of the Excise Act, it's one that is, of course, continuing to create the state's monopoly over the sale of alcohol, but one also where offenses are punishable by less than 7 years, which in legal terms is an offense for which arrest is not considered to be mandatory, right? So when we looked at these about 540 FIRs from Madhya Pradesh, we found that communities that were primarily being criminalized were those who belong to the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, other backward classes, and of course, the Vimukta communities. And, they were being criminalized primarily for brewing mahua, which is a traditional liquor that is brewed by Adivasi and Vimukta communities across the country. And we saw that the quantity of the mahua was also as ridiculously low as max, 1 liter to 10 liters, right? So in popular imagination, we see that policing is this sort of idea is that, you need the police to crack down on the liquor mafias. But what we essentially see here is that it's actually alcohol that is brewed by marginalized communities and really small quantities of alcohol that is being criminalized, right? And within this criminalization of alcohol in India, we see that about 41 women are implicated from 2 Vimukta communities, which is the Kuchbandia and the Kanjar communities, right? Of these 41 women that are criminalized, about 39 belong to the Kuchbandia and Kanjar communities and some from the Gond communities. And there are only 2 that belong to non-Adivasi communities, and only one woman who belongs to an oppressor caste community, right? And so this data tells you that there is this clear targeting of certain communities by the police under the Excise Act. And we see this particularly in the case of Jabalpur, which is a district in Madhya Pradesh, where we see that one police station, which is Ghamapur police station, is one that has primarily been targeting women from the Kuchbandiya community. And what does this criminalization mean, right? It means that there are women, individual women who have been arrested for between 23 to 28 times between the year 2018 to 2020 and are now labeled as habitual offenders. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the habitual offender status means that, one is subjected to constant surveillance, one is required to report themselves to the police, and it also means that one's access to bail is impeded and one's access to securing one's liberty is impeded. And more fundamentally, what it does is that it opens one up to the likelihood of being implicated in future cases. And therefore, it is this entry point of Vimukta women in the criminal justice system and the ramifications of that. To do that, what we also did is to look at the bail orders that were passed by the Madhya Pradesh High Court under the Excise Act, right? And so we, to just for our audience, and particularly those that don't have a background in law, being arrested means that you will be sent to judicial custody, or what in common parlance is known as jail, and therefore one is required to go to bail, go to court to secure bail. And in these cases, in the case of Excise Act in Madhya Pradesh, as a matter of convention, one is required to go to the High Court. And a survey of bail orders by the High Court of Madhya Pradesh, again between the year 2018 to 2020, said that there were about several Kuchbandiya women who were implicated in these cases. And it also tells us that actually bail was denied in several cases by saying that these women were habitual offenders. In one case, the state merely claimed that 50 cases were filed against a woman from the community, and the judge on record fails to examine these cases before terming the woman as a habitual offender and refusing her bail. And even in some other cases, it says that, okay, harsher bail conditions need to be imposed on this woman because she belongs to an erstwhile criminalized tribe and is a habitual offender. And this is after this person has spent 193 days in custody. So we see that this narrative of criminality that is derived from the CTA is one that continues to be peddled and continues to be circulated through the criminal justice system and is entrenched by the present day criminal justice system, right? And we see this very clearly, particularly, when in one case a police personnel remarked to us that it's actually the women that are kingpins and they are the ones who are carrying out this entire business, right? And what does this do to these women when they're approaching the criminal justice system for when harm is caused to them? In 2017, in the district of Bhopal, a 30-year-old woman from the Vimukta Pardhi community died by suicide as a result of police harassment when her family approached the Madhya Pradesh High Court after the police refused to register an FIR. The Madhya Pradesh High Court, during its hearing, decided to delve into the criminal antecedents of the woman who had died by suicide and who was the victim in this case, because the state argued that she was a habitual offender. So similarly, we have cases where women from Pardhi community were abducted and sexually assaulted, but the court charged, the police charged them for theft instead because these are habitual offenders. So we see that this criminalization is used to obfuscate the harm against Vimukta women. And there is a particular history to this, right, within the criminal justice system, particularly in the case of harm that is perpetuated by the police. And if we go back to this, the origin story of this in so many ways is through the case of Mathura, which is the first time that custodial violence or custodial rape by the police was recognized in this country. In this case, the Supreme Court said, and I quote, that since there were no injuries shown in the medical report on the body of the woman, the story of stiff resistance having been put up by the girl is all false, and the alleged sexual intercourse was a peaceful affair. So what we see here is that the absence of any marks on the body of an Adivasi woman therefore become a way to falsify the narrative against her, and the court refers to her as promiscuous and a girl of loose morals. So we see that kind of narrative being utilized, throughout by the criminal justice system to not just perpetuate violence against women belonging to Bahujan communities, but also to inscribe and entrench their criminality, right? But on the other hand, we've seen that upper caste women in so many ways when the court looks at cases of sexual violence against upper caste women, and even when, cases result in convictions, we see that the language that is used is the one of honor, and, the language of saying that we need to safeguard the honor of this woman, and a good Indian woman would never lie. This is the language that is commonly seen in sexual violence cases. So we see that, that there is this imbuing of the oppressor caste woman's body with honor and dignity. So what we do, and what an analysis and a disaggregated analysis of data does, is that it really helps us dispel the notion of homogeneity that accompanies the kind of casteless framing of gender categories, particularly that of women within the criminal justice system, right? And what looking at the institution of policing does is that it allows us to move beyond the paradigm on convictions and acquittals to imagine what justice looks like, and really draws our attention to the everyday violence that is being perpetuated by the criminal justice system, right? So, particularly after 2018, since Me Too, and especially last year, we've seen that there have been multiple cases of criminal defamation that have been filed against women who called out their abusers during the Me Too movement. Last year we saw that sort of criminalization of Riya Chakrabarti in the Sushant Singh Rajput case. And, there was this whole narrative saying that, it makes us want to smash patriarchy to say that the criminal justice system is patriarchal. But it is actually Brahminical patriarchy that we've been grappling with all along. And that is something that this data and the stories of Vimukta women draws our attention to. And more importantly, what it compels us to ask is questions about what are we missing, about the everyday resistances of Vimukta and other Bahujan women within the criminal justice system, by merely looking at them and normalizing this lens of criminalization and looking at the criminal justice system purely through the binaries of conviction and acquittals, right? And it is that we need to delve into. And with this, I think I am out of time. So I will end my note here today. Thank you so much for having me here, and Jai Bhim to everyone.
Thanks so much, Nikita, for sharing that talk with us. I think there was a little bit of a tech glitch in the middle, and I think we can go back to your. So two things I've been told to just request. One is that I think you'll have to move back a little bit. We can't see you properly. Yeah, this is fine. And I think the slides did come on. So if you want to go back to your slides at any point of time in our conversation, we can, of course, organize for that as well. So your call in the conversation. But thank you so much for sharing this. We've had a lot of very interesting conversation around, law, data, research through this conference. And I want to pull some of those threads together and ask and open up some more questions. I think one very pertinent thing is this, critical question of research and data, right? Like you were saying, certain communities are continuously framed as criminal in law. And when I look at it from a development intervention lens, donor, funding systems frame certain communities as the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, the most something or the other, and therefore targeted, quote unquote, for interventions. And I'm wondering, in the framework of our conference, how do we find a narrative of agency and a choice and assertion and resistance to articulate or to create data and show the reality of these communities? How do we make that switch? How do we include them in doing that as well? I mean, that is something that I would like to start with for you as a researcher to respond to.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to really be able to reflect on this binary of the researcher and the research subject that we've created, right? And I think what this kind of work allows us to do is to really be able to center the narratives of these communities, because these are communities that have been resisting even before the researchers and the NGOs and the donor organizations came along. And they've been pushing back and they've been resisting against this system. So I think it's important to see how we can center those narratives, and not just center their narratives as subjects of a criminal justice system or subjects that were criminalized by a system, but also narratives of personhood, and to see that these are individuals who we have some really wonderful people from Vimukta communities here who resist through their writing, who resist through their art, and also who in their everyday lives are resisting the system. And I mean, they're not necessarily resisting in the way that an upper caste, there is an upper caste imagination of what resistance looks like, but their lives are intertwined with the idea of resistance. And I think it is that needs to be centered, and there is, I think, is what I think needs to come forward and needs to be a part of our research process.
Thank you. And I think I would also like to highlight for everybody else, tomorrow we have a panel on exactly this, on communities who are left out of being given the opportunity or being allowed in this data creation hierarchy of creating their own data, how they take over, create their own data. We have a panel on this tomorrow, and I think what you're saying speaks a lot to those questions. The other very interesting point that you made in there was about the culpability of women. One hopes that with the change, with independence, a constitution and a law that is our own will provide liberation, will provide some recourse. But instead, even the laws that replace the colonial laws make women more and more culpable. I also thought of parallels in, say, the laws around sex work, when you were talking about the laws around infanticide, the laws around abortion being as such. And if you can examine this a little bit further, like how does this whole culpability of women, how is that gendered, perspective coming in through the law and affecting the lives of women, particularly in these communities?
So, of course, I mean, like I was saying earlier, whether it's the laws around sex work, whether it's, the laws that are there to address questions of sexual violence, we see that, when women from these communities are reaching out to the system to seek redress of any kind, we see that like this whole narrative of, them being criminals and therefore never being ones who can be at the receiving end of any kind of violence comes into play, right? So the instances that I was referring to during the course of my talk, particularly the case of Indramal Bai, the deceased Pardhi woman from Bhopal, you see this happening very interestingly, where a woman has died as a result of police violence, but the entire system, including the judiciary, is interested in delving into her criminal antecedents. And that kind of juxtaposition tells you that if you are considered to be a criminal, it just means that if any kind of harm that is caused to you is invisibilized or in so many ways diminished, right? So therefore, it's almost like if you have to approach the system, you have to approach the system with these kind of clean hands, and you have to be a pure woman, a respectable woman, in order to be able to expect the system to deal with you or to apply its mind to the question of justice or addressing the harm against you. And I just want to, Manak, if we can look at I think it's slide 3 of my PPT, which shows the data.
Because I think we can go to the slide.
Yeah, where the one that talks about policing. I'm sorry.
Can we bring the slide 3 from the PPT back again, and then
Okay. I can just see. Yeah, I can see this now. Yeah, so it tells you here, right? It tells you that there is an offense of alcohol prohibition, which is of course something that is applicable across the country, but it tells you there are women from only a certain community that are being criminalized here, right? And like, the numbers are staggering, right? Because there is only one woman from an oppressor caste community who features here. And it's not just about that one woman, it's also about what will be the experience of, those 39 women vis-a-vis that one woman with the criminal justice system, right? We say the process is the punishment, but is the process going to be the punishment in the same way for both these sets of women is something that I think I want us to reflect on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for drawing that out. And I think just the other thing, as you're talking about this slide, that I was thinking about is that we heard a talk yesterday also of this whole concept of sex ed nationalism, right? Where the whole idea of a country like Amsterdam saying when we are doing sexuality education with our children, they will understand that porn is not reality. But when immigrant children see it, they don't understand this. And I think it's the same kind of attitude that we have around communities of women when we are talking about sexuality, even when we are talking about things like sexuality education, sexual and reproductive health and rights, that constructs, and you had an interesting point in there also about how the court talks about the sexuality of Vimukta women very differently. So could you speak to that a little bit as well, saying what is that intersection between the assumption of a certain kind of sexuality in one community as against a certain kind of honorability of another community, which requires maybe not that much pedantic teaching?
Yeah. So I just want to respond to that with two judgments that have come out of the Supreme Court of India, right? One is Uday versus State of Karnataka in the year 2003, where a woman from an OBC community approaches the court saying that she was raped by offering a promise of marriage by a man who belonged to the Brahmin community, and the court in this case, while acquitting the accused person, says that an intercaste marriage is not permissible in Indian society, and just the fact that this woman has engaged in sex outside of her caste means that she's a promiscuous woman, and therefore this can't be a case of sexual violence, and the accused person is acquitted. And you see several other cases where there is where these are cases of rape where there is conviction that is meted out. And the reasoning you see is to say, okay, proper Indian woman, an honorable Indian woman with dignity would never falsely accuse a man of having raped her, right? So you see that, that there is a vast contrast within the way that this discourse is framed by the court and the kind of language that is used to make sense of harm, right? So, I mean, when you see that conviction is, made in this case, the case that I'm referring to is Boginbhai Bharwada from Gujarat, which was heard by the Supreme Court. You see that, okay, there is conviction that is there. And, our analysis is also to say that, well, the court is relying on the notion of honor, which is patriarchal. But what we're not seeing is that notion is not going to be applied across the board, right? There are several women who are going to fall through that cracks. And it also tells you what the experiences of those women are within the system and how is it that we are even framing the discourse, right? We've seen this, and this is something that women particularly activists from Bahujan communities have repeatedly highlighted that the kind of response also to any kind of violence against an upper caste woman is drastically different from the response to violence against a Dalit woman, right? We saw that particularly in the aftermath of the 2012 gang rape in Delhi, and the way that the system responded after the Hathras case that happened last year. So I think it is that kind of contrast and the way that the bodies of certain women are dealt with and are, dealt with by the system is one, I think, that needs to be analyzed.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes and there's a bunch of questions that are now there in the question box. So I'm going to switch to those. The first question we had is around the bringing in of technological mechanisms in the documentation of cases by police. CPAP has also done some work on this. And so has that helped marginalized communities in fighting back? That's one question.
Has the documentation helped?
Yeah, in fighting back. The question is about whether this technological mechanism for documentation helps in fighting back.
So I'm going to respond to that question in two ways. The documentation is one that definitely helps, because what it does is that it uses the data by the state to critique the state and to see how there is that sort of targeting and disproportionate targeting of certain communities that's carried out. The question of digitization of this kind of data is one that we should be extremely wary of, because now there are steps that are being taken in this country to create digital databases of police data in order to make the system more efficient. In so many ways, the argument is that, the neutrality of technology is going to eliminate the human bias that prevails in the system. But that is something that needs to be dealt with caution, because the origin point of this data is one that is rooted, like I said, in the registers and the criminalization of certain communities. So, one can only imagine what the digitization of that is going to do. And we've seen what that has done in the US, particularly to African American communities. So while the documentation of this is absolutely crucial, and while technology also is useful, I think it's important for us to not see that as a one-stop solution to any of this, but also think about it more critically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks so much. So I'm going to just go through the questions just in the interest of time as well. There is one question that says, I want to understand if you have any insights on how this sort of criminal justice system affects these communities in areas which have acts like the AFSPA in place. So that's one question, where there is an additional oppressive act in place. How does that add a certain additional layer to this existing criminalization?
So, there are, of course, the history and context of AFSPA, and particularly of communities that are targeted by AFSPA in the Northeast and, of course, in Kashmir are vastly different. And these are two very different historical contexts that we shouldn't be merging. But, of course, what a law like AFSPA does is even, really in so many ways, it's giving up on the pretense of following any kind of due process, right? And it gives the state untrammeled powers and legitimizes the powers of disproportionately targeting people and giving, like AFSPA allows for shoot at sight orders, etc. So like the principle of innocent until proven guilty is turned on its head by laws like AFSPA and UAPA, which is, which of course in the context of Kashmir, etc., has different ramifications given the histories of those geographies. But of course, we see that these are principles that are constantly subverted when it comes to marginalized communities by the state, because even in the case of Vimukta communities, even in the case of several Adivasi communities, we see that this innocent until proven guilty principle, which is supposed to be the cardinal principle, is one that doesn't hold true.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is around, so I'll just read out the question. It starts with, thank you so much, Nikita. And then says, I always wonder, how do Dalit rights activists see intra-caste patriarchy becoming a script of historical denial narrative that gives little space for exploring and critiquing patriarchy within the Dalit movement itself?
Intra-caste patriarchy being a script of historical denial narrative that is, I don't think the Dalit movement or the Bahujan movement at large is in denial about patriarchy. In fact, it is from these movements that the connection or the intersection of caste and patriarchy is one that has been made. If what the question suggests is that there is an exclusive kind of patriarchy that is applicable to Dalit Bahujan people, then that's not something that is true. But there is, of course, a constant reflection and resistance by women, particularly Bahujan women, against patriarchy of all kinds, including patriarchy that is perpetrated on them by Bahujan men, right? So here, again, if I were to speak from my experience in Madhya Pradesh, for Vimukta women, of course, there is that resistance against the state and, the state-led violence. But there is also resistance against an oppressive system, within the family, within the community, that, is a denial of their rights, and one that, is makes that existence difficult, right? So we see this very, very clearly, that the resistance is not mutually exclusive, and of course, one that is also part of this larger resistance.
Mm-hmm. And so before I bring in more of my thoughts and connections with the conference across, I'll just maybe read out the two questions that we have, maybe because they're a little bit connected. So one is that somebody is saying that as an upper caste woman researcher, how can I reflect on my own positionality with respect to participants from oppressed communities and ensure their voice is central to the work? And we have often also wondered around this, right? Like our response to that as an organization has been that it must be, if we go and work as an organization that does not have its roots in, say, Dalit rights movements or Dalit communities, then when we go to work with these communities, it must be a collaboration of the kind where we are continuously sort of giving up more space, right? But as a researcher, how would you respond to something like this?
Collaboration is one, and the other is that I think for upper caste researchers, it would be a great start by grappling with their own caste identities, right? Because I think what this kind of research work has done is that it's really bolstered this kind of discourse where caste has become synonymous with oppressed caste and almost like everybody else is casteless, right? As Dr. Satish Deshpande refers to it. So I think engaging with the question of caste is, I think it's always a great start to, as the cliche goes, where they say charity begins at home, to therefore then engage with one's own caste location and see, where, how one is occupying space. I think that's always a first great step because, each time there is any kind of engagement or any kind of literature, I think you see around caste, you will see the word Dalit 10,000 times, but almost, maybe one time that, any kind of research around Brahmins and Banyas and any of those other oppressor castes that you will see any kind of work being done around them. So I think it would be a great start for people to apply their minds to the question of caste in first person.
Mm-hmm.
Whether as researchers or individuals.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And we've often said, like, right, when feminist movements started working on gender, the assumption was that gender is only women. When we start working on sexuality, it is assumed that only queer people or alternative sexualities, quote unquote, have a sexuality and nobody else has one. Yeah. And now that same narrative, so it's a great position, a great place from which to start thinking about these issues. Thank you for that response. So the last question that we have in the box right now is it feasible to think of creating primary data collection efforts to mitigate the data set bias issues? Because this primary raw data bias is prevalent all across the board of social data by the nature of our institutions, probably, right? So, yeah. So I maybe this question is also, I would also say, what is it that we need to do? Like, how do communities need to be involved in creating large primary data sets about themselves? How can we go there, perhaps, is what I would add to this question.
I mean, to think of this, and the way that we've been trying to do this is also to see how, you have to have people involved from the point at which you're even thinking about framing your research questions, right? because what kind of questions need to be asked and what deserves to be researched is one that needs to be determined and explored by those whose lives we're talking about, right? Because I think right now, a lot that is happening is that you see that sort of community involvement only at the level of field work, right? Where there is that field worker and researcher binary, and the field worker is only there, implementing the questionnaires and conducting the interviews, right? But it is from the stage of conceptualization of what research looks like. And as you would say, like these are communities who have to be involved in the process of knowledge production, because it is their knowledge that we're ultimately even tapping into as researchers. So I think that's something that needs to be done, because otherwise, it has the effect of constantly reifying those structures of oppression that we are, I would hope, trying to subvert as researchers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks so much for that, Nikita. I think what is most interesting, I think one of the connections that I would really like to draw out for people is that as an organization invested and operating from a health space, right? I think this health, nutrition, we look at only particular kinds of data sets. And there is a big move sometimes to remove the caste analysis from these kinds of data sets. So don't segregate it. And continuously we have said as interveners that we would need segregated data. Give us data about different communities differently. And I think one of the things that I am definitely learning from here is that one, the importance that you've drawn out of criminal record data in seeing the trajectory of a community and how it's been fundamentally sort of repeatedly oppressed and operating, being conscious of that. And the other is of what you're also saying of involving, like changing the hierarchy of who is the data creator and who is the subject of data. Fundamentally, that's the kind of work that would be more and more exciting to see. So I think, are there any further, no, there aren't any other questions in the chat, and we are just about out of time. So I would like to just thank you so much for giving your time so generously and being part of the Love, Sex and Data Conference. We are really excited that you could participate, and I hope you stay for the next set of things that are to come in today's session. With that, I would like to close this particular discussion and this part of the conference and hand over to Deepshikha, who started it off today.
Thank you so much, Nikita. Thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for sharing it with us. I, for one, was taking copious notes about everything that you were saying. And while this is a sobering reality, there is, a lot that we can, really look back and think about how we add or dismantle a certain narrative. So thank you so much. And I'm glad that this is being recorded, so we can always go back and see the talk again. And thank you so much, Manak, for moderating the question and answer. I think the conversations between the two of you has made the conversation even more rich. Thank you. Okay, everybody, or the people who are listening to us here, please do not leave, not just yet, because picture abhi baki hai mere dost. We get to hear from more amazing people as it's already been introduced. We are moving to what we call the pleasure pockets, and there we'll get to hear interesting takes on the connection between body and data and body. So the three pleasure pockets are by Abhishek Anika, Anya Kovacs, and Bishakha Datta. A little bit about what these pleasure pockets are. So in a span of about 5 to 10 minutes, these pleasure pockets warrant a burst of emotions. You'll find yourself smiling, you'll find yourself feeling aghast, and you'll also have that eureka moment. So quickly, before we move to actually hearing these pleasure pockets, let me introduce the amazing speakers. Abhishek Anika is a writer, poet, and performer. He identifies as a person with locomotor disability and chronic illness, which shapes his creative endeavors. Abhishek's pleasure pocket makes you wonder, is despo Is being despo and is having hope a synonym after all? Dr. Anya Kovacs directs the Internet Democracy Project. Anya's research and advocacy currently focuses on questions around data governance, surveillance, cybersecurity, and regarding freedom of expression. Anya's Pleasure Pocket talks about the fundamental nature of consent, the illusion of choice, and the sheer joy of advocating for the privacy of data, which now has become an extension of our own bodies. Finally, Vishakha Datta works on gender and sexuality in digital spaces, runs the non-for-profit Point of View in Mumbai, writes and films nonfiction, and gets the most pleasure from exploring marginal, invisible, and silenced points of view. Vishakha's Pleasure Pocket unwraps the power of the idea of data. Is data singular or is it plural? And who cares if it is? So come, let's hear the Pleasure Pockets.
Despo. It had been 2 years, 3 months, and 5 days since I had kissed someone. So when she called to say she was coming in, it was as if the casino that is my body had finally run into some luck. Ka-ching! There were 2 disabled persons, some twisted body parts, a leftover sandwich, and remnants of a kiss asking for direction an hour later. Chemistry is for sciences. We were both art students. 2 happy students making out with each other until she remembered that she had an ex-lover who had dumped her for some pretty-looking other, and I was wet in all the wrong places. It's not her crying that perturbed me. It was the revelation that despite only one of us shaving for the occasion, it was me who was going to be friend zoned within an hour. I flipped out after that. Flipping from one swipe to another, too vulnerable to say, I want love, too insecure to say, I want sex. Oh, you have a disability. We are so sorry for you. Why are you sorry for me? I'm not sorry for myself. Keep your sorry to yourself. A never-ending search. Never-ending search. But I'm at peace with myself. At peace with my loneliness. At peace with the idea that no one wants to touch my body. At peace with being melancholic about my peace. Romantic films, though, are still too violent for my constitution. Don't get me wrong. I love the idea of love. In fact, I love to be in love with the idea of love. But there is a limit here. Being constantly ill and finding love don't make a good pair. Our schedules are always in conflict. I still remain an undiscovered gem. Undiscovered gem on a map that is hard to find and even harder to navigate. And sooner or later, I have to make peace with my rare status. मेरे नंगे शरीर के मानचित्र को कोई शायद ही पढ़ पाए. भूगोल की उनकी पुस्तकों में मेरे अंग परिभाषित नहीं है. क्या सोए हुए पहाड़ को पठार कहते हैं? ऐसी नदियों का क्या जो सागर में नहीं मिलते, जो बह जाते हैं चुपके से किसी नाली में? उन पत्थरों का क्या जो कठोर बनकर भी तकिए सा कोमल रह जाते हैं? मेरे पास जवाब होते तो मैं भी कर लेता अपना मापन. इसी आईने पर, बना देता एक नया एटलस। काश, काश। Being disabled, ill, and fat, finding what you want is not so simple, boss. Instead of love or sex, in the Brahmanical scheme of things, is mostly property, patriarchy, and parivar. There is a flicker now and then, late at night, when someone messages to say that they relate to my poetry, that they get me. But I have developed quite a lot of mistrust about that. There is good reason to. तुम पढ़ती हो मेरी कविता, तुम पढ़ती हो मेरी कविता घर की चौथी मंजिल पर, लिफ्ट नहीं है, मैं विकलांग, डर लगता है कितना कुछ पहुंच पाता है तुम तक। Fair enough, na? But I still live with hope. You know, there's no other way. Hope is important, so much so that I carry a condom in my purse regardless of the situation. That and a head full of fantasies, which keeps me alive. So whenever life comes knocking at my door, I'm there to say, yes, sir, I'm ready to go, yes, sir. Call me a despo, call me a pervert, call me a dreamer. I don't care. I'm lost in hope. Lost in hope. Lost in the memories of the past, the present, the future. Lost in imaginary lovers. Lost in conversations. 10 साल बाद बिस्तर पर पड़े पड़े मैं काल्पनिक छल्ले बनाता हूं, तुम फूंक कर उन्हें भी कर देती हो गायब। कम से कम सिगरेट पीना तो ठीक से सीख लेते। कैसे बताऊं तुम्हें कितना कुछ भरा है अंदर। जगह होती जरा भी तो नंबर लख लेता तुम्हारा। Too mushy ना? I know I can get very mushy, but क्या करें? What to do? You had been warned. You had been already warned. This poem was called Despo, and I am ready to be a despo whenever the need arises for me to be one. Is that clear? Is that clear? Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today and to get to talk to you about how we can strengthen consent as our lives move more and more online. First of all, why does this conversation matter? In so many ways, of course, consent is really quite integral to pleasure. And so it should give us pause as love and sex increasingly involve the digital as well, that consent online is really fundamentally broken. Consent is often described as a privacy self-management mechanism. So it allows us to make sure that we live online the way we want to. But it's very clear for all of us that it is failing on many fronts, and there is increasing criticism. I think all of us have seen notices that are far too long, too many notices, too much legalese, so it becomes really difficult to comprehend. And there are many more problems like this. Really, then the central problem is that even though we are supposedly consenting, we really don't know what we are signing up for. A Norwegian consumer organization looked, for example, at third-party data sharing by dating apps and found that many dating apps shared their data with hundreds and sometimes even thousands of apps. That's really problematic because apps like Grindr, Tinder, and OkCupid gather really sensitive information about us. They don't just have your exact location and your sexual orientation, but also often information on your religious and political beliefs, drug use, other information, whether or not you are in favor of abortion. And you think you are sharing that information to find a partner with similar beliefs. But what we often don't realize is how many other entities actually get access to this data. And in the case of the 10 dating apps that that consumer organization looked at, each app shared that data with at least 135 different companies. And we really have no control over where that goes. All of this is legal though, in the name of consent. And it's really quite remarkable that at the moment, unlike any other fundamental human right that we have, we can simply sign away our right to privacy by ticking a box. If consent online is really so broken, and if that is so obvious to many of us, and if it's so obvious that this is really problematic to many of us, then why are we still stuck with this? Really, the big reason behind this is the way we look at data. Overall, in all debates around data, in policy, in business, etc., data is fundamentally framed as a resource. It's talked about as this thing that is out there, apart from us, disembodied and ready to be mined. And because we look at data in that disembodied way, it becomes a valid means for exchange. So you give your data and in exchange you get a service. That disembodied view of data does not match our experience though. For example, just think about how targets of the non-consensual sharing of sexual images often talk about their own experience. Most women and queer people who have been at the receiving end of that don't just talk about it in terms of a data protection violation, not even just a privacy violation. Very often, they compare their experiences to sexual assault. And so the sharing of non-consensual sharing of sexual images becomes a matter of bodily integrity. We saw the same in India also when the Suli deals scandal happened, in which an app was built on which images of Muslim women were put, who were then supposedly put up for sale. The women, many of the women who were featured on that app actually talked about it very much in terms as a bodily experience. They were very conscious of the fact that this was not just their pictures being put up for sale. It was really trying to indicate that they and their physical bodies were up for sale. So what we see here is that in very concrete and intimate ways, actually, our data is almost, it's so interconnected with our bodies that the line between our physical and digital bodies almost become irrelevant. And what some scholars have argued is that we therefore really need to start thinking about our bodies differently. Data is really becoming an extension of our bodies. And so your body doesn't stop anymore where your skin touches the earth. It has many more ways into the world. In data governance, because it really starts from data as a resource, this is not taken into account. And that's why we are not able to think of all harms and possibilities that really come with data governance. But when we recognize that data actually is a fundamental extension of our body, things completely change. Because when we do that, we can look at other areas of consent where the body has been discussed extensively. And one such area is, of course, feminist debates around consent in sexual relationships. We know that, for example, consent is not simply a yes or no that you give at the outset. It needs to be built and be asked again and again in different acts, different situations. It's a process that opens up a conversation. It allows for negotiation, including on the terms of the engagement, and it must be proactive. But perhaps most importantly, what feminism has taught us is that the autonomy in which consent is embedded is relational, not individual, and the broader conditions really matter. We are not automatically free and equal individuals. Consent needs to be created to make that possible. And so this brings to the table really the notion of power relationships. We need to create the conditions so that each individual can consent freely rather than assume this. And this, what is then the lesson for data governance, has to happen online as much as online. At the moment, consent is really online, used as a legitimization of a new set of power relationships, both ideological and in practice, while obscuring a broader set of harms, and the responsibility for these unequal power relations and any harms that might occur is put on us. What we need to do then It's really think about consent through a lens where we can make it meaningful, and that will require a fundamental restructuring of our digital environment at many different levels. How that needs to look at exactly, feminism can point out the way forward. Thank you so much.
Hi there, my name is Bishaka, and a funny thing happened to me a few years back. I was traveling in the United States where my surname Datta is commonly mispronounced Data. So this lawyer comes up to me and says, "Oh, your surname is so now, so on trend, you know. If we just removed one alphabet, it would be data, or as we call it, data." I gaped at him in a foolish manner, literally speechless. Mainly because I didn't realize surnames fell into the list of things that could be considered hip or trendy or contemporary. But anyway, you see, what does it tell us about the way we think about data nowadays? So I didn't know this then, but the word data is actually the plural of the Latin word datum, which means a piece of information. So the way it's used is like this. That fact is a datum worth taking into account. Today, of course, we'd say that's an interesting data point, but that is not actually the point. The point is kind of linguistic and cultural and about how we know what we know. So strictly speaking, datum is the singular form and data is the plural form. Strictly speaking, it should be data are, but we typically say data is. The data is telling us that. The data is showing us that. We never say the data are telling us that or showing us that. So this is the big data is, data are debate. And it's not just some arcane academic debate. It actually raged across mainstream and social media, especially since several big media outlets like The Guardian had to decide whether or not to queer data by subverting its plural grammatical origins, right? So you're probably looking at an example of what happened when this debate went online and people had to decide whether we say data is or data are. Eventually, data is what's won, and Oxford Dictionary basically said this is a mass noun, which also I had no idea any such thing existed. But I think the bigger question is really, why does any of this matter? Who cares whether data is singular or plural, right? So writes scholar Daniel Barker, what could be forgiven as a minor grammatical mistake might actually be a microcosmic example of a modern cultural phenomenon. We no longer seem to know the difference between data, knowledge, and information, and that is a dangerous thing. So there's a saying, when money talks, nobody listens to the grammar. It shows the power of money. It shows the power of the idea of money. And it's pretty much the same with data. When we talk about data, nobody listens to the grammar. Again, it shows the power of the idea of data and how it's taken over our ways of thinking and seeing, or our ways of knowing actually in the last 50 plus years, which is when we used the term data much, much more. And how it's taken over sort of the whole idea of knowing. So think about it. In an earlier age, we would say, how do you know that? This has now been replaced with, what data do you have to support that? So that is actually the point that I was trying to make, that words have power. And the way we use words reveals the power of the underlying ideas they express. And as we know, the power of data has grown immensely with the rise of digital devices, computers, and the internet. So again, to quote Barker, who said that the advent of computers has turned data into the digital equivalent of snow, something that's essentially sort of out there, amorphous, uncountable, and easier to refer to in aggregate. Something fundamental has shifted when the boundary between data, information, and knowledge gets blurred to the point of oblivion, when the part becomes the whole, greater than the sum of its parts. So when we come to sort of the whole question of knowledge or knowing, how do we know ourselves now? What does it mean to take the saying, know thyself, and apply it today? One part of it is through measurement or data, or through what is called the quantified self, or I measure, therefore I am. So I wanted to give you an example of sleep. Imagine you had a night of deep sleep with pleasurable dreams, erotic dreams, wet dreams maybe. Imagine your Fitbit or your measurement device or the data told you the exact opposite. No, you didn't have a good night's sleep. Your performance in bed didn't measure up to the average. You slept less hours, your REM sleep was weaker, blah, 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 blah. So again, I think we come back to sort of fundamental questions about the relationships between pleasure and data, right? Pleasure is subjective. Data may be whatever it is, but it pretends to be objective. When I hear the words or the word data, I think numbers, I think Excel sheets, and I think dry. And strangely enough, we often trust the knowledge we get from data more than we trust the experience of our bodies. There's lots and lots and lots of examples, but I really wanted to stick with the sleep one. So I think the thing is that if we really think of data as something that's kind of dry and a kind of knowledge, right, that is numerical, I guess the question is really like, how do we undry data? How do we wet data? How do we, now that the data beast has woken up, how do we sort of pat it back to sleep so that we're not slaves to data and that our embodied experiences, our pleasures, our messiness, all of that, right, can come into knowing, into information, the ways we know ourselves. How do we make it? As the information is beautiful team says, juicy. How do we make it juicy data? I wanted to leave you with this lovely visual and with this whole question about the tangle between data, information, knowledge, ways of knowing, and really putting pleasure into that and saying, how can we move this dry thing to something that is juicy, to something that actually makes us smile, something that gives us joy? That would be the twin of data. Thanks.
With this, the session comes to a close. Such intriguing conversations. I am sure that all of us are in an extremely reflective space. There is a lot of learning and unlearning that has happened here. Extremely grateful to all of you who were able to attend the session. Thank you so much for asking your questions and making the conversation even more rich. And a big, 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 big thank you to Nikita, Manak, Abhishek, Anya, and Vishaka for making this session absolutely brilliant. We have equally amazing, fun, and deeply engaging conversations awaiting us. A reminder, please do not forget to join the open mic, Aaj Ki Taza Pleasure, moderated by Samira Iyengar at 8 p.m. today. And also tomorrow we have the Lonely Hearts Club, a documentary theater show that combines varied lived experiences of queerness and hetero identities, reflecting upon voyeurism and vulnerability through the lens of erotica. So please find this on the website. You can also find the details on the chat. Please go and check this out and join us tomorrow as well. Also, please let the world know that you're here and just how much fun you're having. And please, please, please use the hashtags that have been shared with you on the chat. And do not forget to tag Agents of Ishq and the YP Foundation. Please continue to visit the website and continue to be with us. Share the love. Thank you so much for being amazing. Bye.